So this is the video I've been promising you for a while now. Basically, we're going to fabricate a power window regulator for a 65 Chevy pickup, and we're going to, it should work 60 all the way through 66. Somebody's going to have to try this and let me know if it works on the earlier models. But what you see here is about $100 worth of parts for one window. This is the driver's side because we've already done the passenger side. And keep in mind that we didn't have to buy a new window regulator here. We did for the purposes of this video, but I could have just as easily taken the old one out of the truck and used it because it's virtually identical. And so these are the tools that I believe we're going to need to do this job. We'll find out as we go. And you'll notice here that I actually have two power window motors, and I'll explain later why we need both of those. And so basically what we're going to do here is we're going to take this power window regulator that you see here. I'm going to show you a few components on here. Number one, this piece here is called the sector. It's the piece with teeth in it that is supposed to move up and down, that engages with the drive gear on the electric motor. In this case, is engaging with the drive gear on the original mechanical handle. And then on the back here we have the spring. And so what I want to point out to you is that in my first version of this I left the spring in because it seems to help the much smoother travel moving up and down, but the fact of the matter is that this spring being in place when we disengage this is dangerous because this will act like a guillotine, and once I cut this out it'll suddenly, the spring will unwind and this thing can chop as a chopping action. If your finger's in the wrong place you could get hurt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this spring off of this window regulator, and probably vice grips is the correct tool to do this with. I'm going to get a pair of those. So what I did was the spring tension on this was kind of tight, and so I manually moved the regulator down to its lowest position. And now I'm going to take this pair of vice grips and I'm going to grab the spring here and then pop it off. I'm taking most of the spring tension off. I want to keep in mind where it was at because we're going to go ahead and put this back on when we're done. So just to get good in my head where it's sitting, you may want to take a picture of it yourself so you know. But when we get all done, we'll probably put that spring back on. So the spring is now off. We've got it set aside. And so we're going to next extract the old manual gear teeth engagement system, or whatever you want to call this, the original mechanical gear that ran against the sector and ran this up and down. And so to do that, what I did on the other one was I take a standard die grinder, angle grinder, and I put one of these cutoff blades on it that you can buy at Harbor Freight for almost nothing. And so the goal is we're going to go ahead and cut right around the edge of this thing, try to get a nice clean cut and get this off. I'll show you how that comes apart once we get it cut. Okay, so now for this portion of this I have put on my eye protection and my ear protection. I'm going to go ahead and hook this up, make sure it's off. Okay, so notice I wasn't terribly careful about this. It turns out that it's probably not as important to be pretty when you're doing this as it is to get a nice clean cut and get it apart. What now I'm just going to pry the rest of that off. So now you can see in there that there's the gear, and notice that it's kind of lost its integrity now. Thing is just kind of wobbling around in there. And so what we need to do now is grind off these rivet heads and then pop the rest of this thing out. This whole plate should come off once I pop out those rivet heads. We're going to be nice to those because I need those holes, and I'll show you later what those holes are used for. Okay, so we've ground off the rivet heads. We've tried not to eat up a bunch of this metal. Notice that this little nub, I've kind of tried to leave this intact. Didn't want to grind that nub off, because that nub appears to be what the sector rides on. It's kind of some kind of shim that keeps the sector from rubbing against the plate. So I don't know what you call that little spacer, that little proud point. Let's not grind that off. Let's just leave that intact as much as we can. Now I'm going to go get a center punch and I'm going to knock those rivets the rest of the way out. Okay, so the tool I've got may not be the right tool for the job, but one of these two is going to do the job. That one's out, that one's out, and basically the whole thing just popped out. So now we're apart, that part just came out, and now we're free. Notice that the hole is a little bit jagged here, but it turns out that making this hole nice and clean, well, you can do it and get rid of the burrs so that it doesn't actually cut into your hand or anything like that. Making it clean is probably not terribly important, and we'll find out here in a few minutes. So now let's take a closer look at these motors that we ordered. Now that we've got this apart, we'll set it out of the way, and we'll set the parts kind of out of the way. So notice that we ordered two motors here, and I'll explain why. So this one, and notice we got some bolts. We're going to end up using these bolts. And then I ordered this. This is the wiring harness that plugs into the bottom of this for wiring purposes. We'll get to that later. But this is a 742150 Dorman power window regulator. This power window regulator actually fits in the Chevy square bodies. Okay, that would be all the Chevys built from 73 all the way through 87, the pickups, the Blazers, and the Suburbans. So it turns out that the only reason we need to order that is for this bracket right here. Okay, this magic bracket is what's going to allow us to do everything that we need to do. This motor is totally useless. You can give this to your square body buddies, use it on your square body if you happen to own one, but the fact of the matter is we will not use this motor for this project. So this kit right here is about $22, I believe, is what I paid for the whole thing, including shipping. And so it's not a huge waste. Basically what I'm telling you is that you're paying $22 for this plate. If anyone can find this plate for less, please let me know and we'll add it to the video. But this plate really is the only purpose for buying this motor. So now we can set this thing completely aside. Now let me just show you real quick why we can't use this tool. Take a look here. These teeth do not mesh. I'll get up close here. These teeth do not mesh into this sector. They are the wrong pitch. And so this motor will not work for this exercise. So we're going to get rid of that. Set it aside to avoid confusion. Now, the correct motor is actually a Dorman Also, this one is marked with a C468701, but it's actually a Chevy Astro. I believe this is the 85 through 90 Chevy Astro power window motor, and there's probably other ones. Again, notice that the number marked on here is C468701. And I'll find if there's a cross-reference, I'll put it in the comments of the video. But notice that the gear pattern on this motor is much coarser than the one that we just pulled out. And I'll show you again that these gear patterns are in fact significantly different. And this is the one that we want. So we're going to set this one aside. But notice what's really cool is that it turns out that this plate was designed to fit this motor. So these motors are essentially exactly the same except for this gear. Now notice it does stand just a hair proud, but as soon as we tighten the bolts on that, that's going to suck that up and it's going to work just fine, because this is a stationary shaft in here, and there is a keeper that keeps the gear on, and that keeper is going to add as a spacer for us. That won't hurt us a bit. It's going to work out perfect. Okay, and notice that those holes, the holes line up very nicely. Now, a couple of other things I want to point out to you is that we got, with our motor, we got these bolts. We're going to end up using these bolts. You might want to go to Ace and buy some better bolts, but the fact of the matter is these work just fine. And notice also, I want to point out to you that this bracket does not come with the Chevy Astro motor. It only comes with the square body motors, and so we need this bracket. So we have to buy both of these motors, I'm sorry to say. So, now that we have it, we need to pay a little bit more attention to what it is we're trying to do here. So, how does this go together? Well, basically we want this bracket to become a shim for the sector, to be a travel guide for the sector. And the other thing that it's going to do for us is it's going to put the motor in the correct position and allow the correct bolt-on points. Notice that it's got 4 holes. Once it bolts onto this regulator, then these 4 holes allow for the motor to sit in the correct position and have the correct torque. Now, where is this going to sit? Well, if you think about it, the way that this is going to sit is it's going to be in the passenger's, or the driver's side door. It's going to be sitting this way, and the window is going to roll up like this. Okay, so we want our motor to hang down. And so for the driver's side, we want this orientation when we get done, and actually the orientation is like this. We want the motor against the sector. And so we'll show you here in a moment. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bolt up this. We needed to know that orientation because basically the motor is going to sit here, and this guide, or this bracket, the spacer, whatever you want to call it, is going to sit up against the sector like so. Okay, so this is the way we want to bolt it. We don't want to bolt it like this. We want to bolt it on like this for the driver's side. The passenger side will be exactly the opposite. Okay, so I believe when we did this before, we ended up putting the big bolts over here, which is actually backwards, I think, from what they do. We'll put the big bolts over here and we'll put the small bolts over on the other side. And now it turns out that these big bolts are too big for the holes in this motor, and so we're going to just drill those out just a bit so that this goes in here and sits nice. But we want it to snug down and be a nice tight fit. Now, I will point out at this point that we cannot tolerate any play when we get this motor mated to this window regulator. There's no margin for slop. These have to sit against each other very nicely. And so that is our goal.